How did a group of enslaved people, armed with nothing but machetes and conviction, defeat the greatest military machine of the 18th century and force the world to recognize their sovereignty? This question echoes across the centuries like a drumbeat that refuses to fade, demanding an answer that reaches back to the island the French called Saint-Domingue, the Pearl of the Antilles, the richest colony in the world, built on a foundation of sugar and blood so deep that the soil itself seemed to drink human suffering instead of rain. In the late 1700s, Saint-Domingue was an engine of wealth for the French Empire, producing more sugar and coffee than all the British colonies combined. But that wealth came at a cost measured in broken bodies and shortened lives, where the average enslaved person died within 7 years of arrival, worked to death under the lash of the Code Noir, a legal framework that defined human beings as movable property, as chattel, as things that could be bought, sold, and broken without consequence. But in the hearts of the enslaved, something else was growing, something that could not be whipped out of them, something that whispered of a freedom that belonged not to kings or emperors, but to God and to the souls He created in His own image. The spark came in the darkness of August 1791 in a place called Bois Caïman, where hundreds of enslaved leaders gathered under the cover of thunderstorms and tropical rain to perform a ceremony that would change the course of human history. Dutty Boukman, a Maroon leader, and Hongon stood before the crowd and spoke words that were both prayer and declaration, calling on the spirits of their ancestors and the God of justice to witness their pact, a blood covenant that bound them to liberty or death. No more middle ground, no more submission, no more waiting for permission to be free. They sacrificed a pig, drinking its blood as a symbol of their unity. And when the ceremony ended, the revolt began not as a riot, but as a coordinated military campaign. Plantations burning across the northern plain, slave masters fleeing or facing the justice of those they had oppressed, the fire spreading faster than the French could contain it. Because this was not just anger. This was strategy. This was a people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. From the ashes of those first nights rose figures who would become legends, men and women whose names were later erased from Western textbooks, but whose actions shook the foundations of empire. Toussaint Louverture emerged from the chaos not as a brute, but as a statesman, a formerly enslaved man who could read, who studied military tactics from Caesar and Alexander, who understood diplomacy as well as warfare, who played Spain against Britain against France, switching alliances when necessary, always with the singular goal of abolition and sovereignty in mind. He organized the enslaved into an army that fought with a discipline that surprised European generals, using guerrilla tactics suited to the terrain, hiding in the mountains, striking at night, cutting supply lines, turning the tropical landscape itself into a weapon against invaders who did not understand the land or the people. The European powers watched in horror as their armies fell, not just to black resistance, but to the yellow fever that swept through the ranks of soldiers who had no immunity, a disease that became an ally to the defenders, killing more French troops than bullets ever did. But the revolution was not without its own violence, its own complexities, its own moments of terror, because liberation is rarely clean when it is born from centuries of brutality. When Napoleon Bonaparte came to power in France, he dreamed of restoring the French Empire in the Americas, and he sent an expeditionary force of over 40,000 men, the finest army in Europe, led by his brother-in-law, General Leclerc, with explicit orders to disarm the black population and restore slavery. They arrived in 1802 with ships blocking the harbors, with promises of peace that were lies, with intentions to return the colony to bondage. And for a moment, it seemed the revolution might be crushed. Toussaint was captured through deception, sent to a prison in the French Alps, where he died alone in the cold, betrayed by the very nation that had once claimed to stand for liberty, equality, and fraternity. But the revolution did not die with Toussaint. It passed to Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a man whose fury was matched only by his commitment to freedom, who understood that there could be no negotiation with an empire that sought to return chains to a people who had tasted liberty. Dessalines united the black and mixed-race populations against the common enemy, burning the cities to deny the French shelter, fighting with a ferocity that told the world this land would be a graveyard before it would be a plantation again. The French army, decimated by disease and relentless attacks, surrendered in late 1803, and on January 1st, 1804, Dessalines declared the independence of Haiti, the first black republic in the world, the second independent nation in the Americas, a land born not from the benevolence of colonizers, but from the blood and will of the enslaved. The name Haiti was chosen deliberately, taken from the indigenous Taino word for land of high mountains, honoring the original inhabitants who had been wiped out by European colonization, a symbol that this new nation belonged to those who had been oppressed, not those who had oppressed. The declaration was read aloud in cities and villages, marking the end of slavery forever on the island, a permanent abolition that no law could reverse, no army could undo. But the victory came with a cost that would haunt the nation for centuries. The world did not celebrate Haiti's birth. The world feared it. The United States, a nation built on liberty, yet entrenched in slavery, refused to recognize Haiti for decades, fearing that the example of successful black revolution would inspire enslaved people in the American South to rise up. France demanded reparations, forcing Haiti to pay for the loss of enslaved human beings as property, a debt that crippled the nation's economy for over a century. Britain and Spain watched with suspicion, seeing Haiti not as a nation, but as a threat to the global order of white supremacy and colonial exploitation. Haiti stood alone, a beacon of freedom surrounded by empires that wanted it to fail, a proof of concept that black people could govern themselves, could fight, could win, could build a nation from nothing but the desire to be free. The Revolution of Saint-Domingue was not just a local event. It was a global earthquake that shifted the tectonic plates of history, forcing Europe to confront the contradiction of claiming enlightenment while practicing slavery, forcing the Americas to acknowledge that the enslaved were not passive victims, but agents of their own destiny. The names of the leaders were suppressed, their stories minimized, their achievements attributed to luck or disease rather than strategy and courage, because admitting the truth would be admitting that slavery was not a natural order, but a choice, and that choice could be resisted. But the truth remains, etched in the soil of Haiti, written in the blood of those who died at Bois Caiman, in the mountains where Toussaint planned, in the fields where Dessalines fought, in the declaration that rang out on that first day of 1804. The revolt that built a nation did more than win independence. It shattered the myth of invincibility that empire relied upon. It showed the world that sovereignty is not given, it is taken, that freedom is not a gift, it is a birthright, that a people united by conviction can stand against the greatest powers on earth and say no more. The fire that burned the empire did not go out. It spread, inspiring abolitionists, inspiring revolutionaries, inspiring generations of oppressed people who looked to Haiti and saw proof that liberation was possible. The names may have been erased from some history books, but the legacy cannot be erased from the human spirit. The story of Haiti is the story of what happens when people decide that dignity is worth more than life itself, when they choose to risk everything for the chance to live as God created them to live, free, sovereign, and unashamed. And as we look back on that revolution from the distance of centuries, the question is not whether they succeeded. The question is whether we remember, whether we honor, whether we recognize that the freedom we enjoy today was purchased by people who were willing to burn the world down rather than live in chains. The fire that burned the empire still burns, and it calls to us now, asking what we will do with the freedom they won, what we will build with the sovereignty they secured, what we will say to the world about the power of a people who refuse to be erased. Why was the first Black Republic punished by the entire world for daring to be free? And how did the victors of the revolution become the prisoners of a debt they never owed? This question hangs over Haiti like a curse that was never lifted, a sentence passed not by justice, but by fear. A punishment inflicted not for what Haiti had done wrong, but for what it had done right, for proving that Black people could govern themselves, could defeat empire, could build a nation from the ashes of slavery. And that proof was more dangerous to the world order than any army, more threatening than any weapon, because it exposed the lie that white supremacy was natural, that slavery was necessary, that Black people required white supervision to survive. When Haiti declared independence on January 1st, 1804, the world did not applaud. The world trembled. France, humiliated by the defeat of its finest army, refused to recognize the nation it had failed to conquer, holding diplomatic recognition hostage like a ransom note written in ink and threat. The United States, a nation that had declared its own independence from Britain while holding hundreds of thousands of Black people in chains, saw Haiti not as a sister republic, but as a contagion, a disease of liberty that could spread to the enslaved populations of the American South, inspiring revolts that could burn the plantation economy to the ground. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, refused to recognize Haiti's sovereignty, imposing trade embargoes that strangled the newborn nation's economy, because acknowledging Haiti would mean acknowledging the contradiction at the heart of American slavery, would mean admitting that the enslaved had the same right to freedom that the American founders had claimed for themselves. Britain, which had abolished the slave trade in 1807, but still profited from colonial plantations across the Caribbean, watched Haiti with suspicion, seeing not a nation, but a warning, a reminder that the enslaved were watching, waiting, learning from what had happened in Saint-Domingue, and that knowledge was more dangerous than any rebellion. Spain, which still held colonies in Latin America where slavery thrived, closed its ports to Haitian ships, fearing that the revolution's example would spread across borders like wildfire. Haiti stood alone, surrounded by empires that wanted it to fail, that bet against its survival, that whispered to each other that Black self-governance was an experiment doomed to collapse. Because if Haiti succeeded, if it thrived, if it proved that sovereignty was not the exclusive right of white nations, then the entire architecture of colonialism would crumble, and no empire was willing to risk that. But the diplomatic isolation was only the beginning. The economic strangulation was the real weapon, the slow violence that would do what armies could not, that would cripple Haiti not in a single battle, but across generations, that would extract wealth from a nation that had already lost everything to revolution. In 1825, 21 years after independence, France returned with a demand that was both audacious and cruel. King Charles X sent warships to Haitian waters, not to reconquer the island, but to collect a debt that Haiti did not owe, a bill for the loss of French property. And that property was human beings, enslaved people whose labor had built the colony's wealth, whose bodies had been broken to produce sugar and coffee, whose lives had been counted as assets on French balance sheets. France demanded 150 million francs, a sum so enormous it was equivalent to 10 times Haiti's annual revenue, a debt that would take over a century to pay, a ransom for recognition, for the right to exist as a sovereign nation without the threat of French invasion hanging over every harvest, every trade deal, every decision made in Port-au-Prince. Haiti had no choice. The French fleet sat in the harbor, guns pointed at the capital, and the Haitian government, led by President Boyer, calculated that paying was the only way to prevent another war, another invasion, another attempt to return the nation to bondage. So they agreed. They signed the ordinance. They accepted the debt. And in that moment, Haiti's independence was compromised, not by military defeat, but by economic coercion, not by the sword, but by the ledger, not by what France could take, but by what Haiti was forced to give. The payments began immediately, draining the nation's treasury, diverting funds from schools, from hospitals, from infrastructure, from everything that builds a functioning society, all to compensate former slave owners for the loss of their human property. French banks profited from the arrangement, lending Haiti money at high interest rates to make the payments, creating a cycle of debt that deepened with each passing year, that bound Haiti to French financial institutions the way the colony had once been bound to French plantations. By the time the debt was finally paid off in 1947, over 120 years after it was imposed, Haiti had transferred tens of millions of dollars to France, wealth that could have built roads, schools, hospitals, that could have created the foundation for lasting prosperity, that could have made Haiti the economic powerhouse of the Caribbean, but instead was extracted, siphoned, stolen, leaving the nation impoverished, vulnerable, dependent on foreign aid that came with its own conditions, its own strings, its own forms of control. But the debt was not the only weapon. The historical erasure was equally deliberate, equally calculated, because a revolution that is forgotten cannot inspire. A victory that is not remembered cannot be repeated. A people whose names are erased cannot claim their legacy. Western textbooks minimized Haiti's revolution, reducing it to a footnote, a sidebar, a curious event rather than the earthquake it truly was. Toussaint Louverture was mentioned, if at all, as an exception rather than a leader, his military genius attributed to luck or circumstance rather than strategy and study. Dessalines was portrayed as a brute, his necessary violence emphasized, while the violence of slavery that provoked it was downplayed or ignored. The Bois Caïman ceremony was dismissed as superstition. The spiritual foundation of the revolution treated as primitive rather than powerful, because acknowledging the role of voodoo would mean acknowledging that enslaved people had their own systems of meaning, their own sources of strength, their own connection to the divine that did not require European mediation. The revolution was framed as chaos rather than liberation, as violence rather than justice, as an anomaly rather than a blueprint, because the truth was too dangerous to teach, too inspiring to celebrate, too threatening to the global order that still depended on racial hierarchy and colonial exploitation. Generations of students grew up learning about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Latin American Wars of Independence, but never about Haiti, never about the enslaved people who defeated Napoleon, never about the First Black Republic, never about the price that was extracted for daring to win. This erasure was not accidental. It was policy. It was the intellectual counterpart to the economic strangulation, the cultural weapon that complemented the financial debt, ensuring that Haiti's achievement would not become a beacon for other oppressed peoples, would not inspire movements for liberation across the Americas and Africa, would not challenge the narrative of white supremacy that still undergirded global power structures. But the truth could not be fully erased. It survived in Haitian memory, in the songs sung in Creole, in the stories passed from grandparents to children, in the monuments that stood in Port-au-Prince despite the neglect, in the archives that historians would eventually uncover, in the stubborn persistence of a people who knew what their ancestors had accomplished, even if the world refused to acknowledge it. And slowly, over centuries, the silence began to crack. In the late 20th century, scholars started to revisit Haiti's history, not as a cautionary tale, but as a triumph, not as a failure, but as a foundation, not as an exception, but as an example of what oppressed people can achieve when they unite behind a common cause. Activists began to demand reparations, not from Haiti, but to Haiti, arguing that France owed the nation for the debt that was never legitimate, for the wealth that was extracted under coercion, for the century of economic strangulation that kept Haiti from reaching its potential. In 2003, President Jean-Bertrand Aristide formally requested restitution from France, calculating the debt at over $21 billion in modern currency. But France refused, and Aristide was removed from power months later in a coup that many saw as retaliation for his audacity in demanding justice. The fight continues today, with descendants of the revolution calling for the return of looted artifacts, for the acknowledgement of Haiti's role in global history, for the reparations that were never paid, for the recognition that was never given. The price of sovereignty was heavy, heavier than any nation should have been forced to bear. But Haiti paid it, survived it, endured it, and still stands, still sovereign, still independent, still a testament to what happens when a people decide that freedom is worth any cost. The debt to France is gone, but the debt to history remains. The debt of memory, of acknowledgement, of truth, and that debt is owed not by Haiti, but to Haiti, by a world that looked away when justice was denied, that benefited from the suppression of a story that could have changed everything. And now, as we tell this story again, as we lift the veil that was placed over Haiti's achievement, as we speak the names that were silenced, the question is not whether Haiti deserved better. The question is whether we will do better, whether we will teach this history, whether we will honor this legacy, Whether we will recognize that the freedom we enjoy was purchased by people who were willing to pay a price no nation should have been asked to pay. The revolt built a nation. The world tried to bury it. But the truth remains, and the truth demands that we remember, that we honor, that we ensure the price of sovereignty was not paid in vain. If this story has moved you, if you believe the truth deserves to be told, subscribe to Veil of the Forgotten Bloodline. We uncover the histories they tried to bury and honor the ancestors who refused to be erased.